Hello and welcome back to Joe Bailey Revision. Today we're looking at another episode of biology, and this one's on ecology. So let's begin. So first let's look at adaptations. So an adaptation is a feature or behaviour that makes an animal or plant suited to a particular environment, normally the environment in which it lives. It helps it to survive and thrive there. Let's look at what causes adaptation. So there are lots of different factors. There are abiotic factors and biotic factors. So basically, if changes happen in these things, adaptations will happen to help them be more suited to these environments. So for example, abiotic factors, which are non-living factors in the environment, so the things aren't alive, include things like temperature, water, amount of water available, the amount of oxygen available, the acidity, the light intensity, and the amount of carbon dioxide available. Carbon dioxide obviously being what plants need to get in, and oxygen being obviously what animals need to get in. And another thing we need to look at is temperature. So an example of this would be the polar bear. Why it has thick fur is because it lives in the Arctic, which is a cold place. And one way we can look at water is the camel. It's in a desert, so it can store water for long amounts of time in a large space. And also another thing for water is cactuses. They have a very clever way of storing water within themselves for long amounts of time. When we're looking at acidity, it's mainly about the acidity of soil. So certain plants grow better in certain soils, and they've got used to that over time to thrive in certain places. Also, another thing is light intensity, and this is mainly a thing for plants, again, because they need this for photosynthesis. So for example, seaweed has air bubbles in it, so they rise to the top of the sea and receive more sunlight. So next, let's look at biotic factors. So this is living factors in the environment. So for example, food, predators, pathogens, and competitors. So predators there's going to be a predator in the environment, and maybe they've got to adapt to survive that. And then there's also food in the environment, so they've got to adapt to be able to get the food. Even if they're predators, they've got to be able to catch it. And another thing, pathogens, so they want to adapt to survive against them. About competitors, we'll move on to that later as we're doing competition. So let's go. Another thing about adaptations is extremophiles. They're microorganisms that are adapted to live in extreme conditions. One example of this is thermophiles, which are bacteria that live in extreme heat. So let's move on next. We're looking at competition. This time, not the competitive environment of business. So there are two types of competition. There's interspecific and intraspecific. Interspecific is between individuals of different species, and intraspecific is between individuals of the same species, and this ensures that the best genes are passed on to the offspring, as you'll know from genetics. So let's look at things that there's competition for in animals and plants. So in animals, there's competition for food, because animals are always going to try and hunt certain foods, and some animals will get them, some animals won't. And if you think about it, if they're also competing for others not to catch them, and the others are trying not to be food, and they're trying to get the food, which is interesting. Also, they compete for a mate, obviously, to pass on their genes, and that's how evolution works. The strongest genes survive. Also, water, so animals will fight over water. So maybe particular animals will get water and particular ones won't, and they'll die out. Another thing they fight over is territory. So this is, as I've said, these are between the same species and other species. So certain animals tend to take certain places and not let other animals in there. So next, let's look at plants. So plants need sunlight, they need water, and they need space. So an example of plants fighting for space, it could be the same type of plant or a different type of plant. Sometimes one will grow really high and cast a shadow over the other, take over all of its space. Also, an important thing for plants is they have roots. The roots go deep in the ground and get them nutrients. The more space a plant has, the more room it will have for roots, so the more nutrients it'll be able to gain. Also, of course, as I was saying, they need sunlight for photosynthesis, which means without enough sunlight, they can't survive, so they will compete with other plants for that. Also, water. Water is a key component in photosynthesis, and to keep them living, so that's important. Next, let's cycle around to cycles. So there's two types of cycles, the water cycle and the carbon cycle, and these are really complicated, but I'll try and keep it quick. So the water cycle provides fresh water for land organisms before draining into the rivers and oceans. So let's begin. So it all starts with precipitation, and that's when water droplets from clouds fall as rain, snow, or hail. And after this, it goes in two different ways. So let's start with this way. So it goes into transpiration. So this is water vapor. So it goes into plants. And plants transpire through transpiration and allow water vapor to go back into the atmosphere. So then this water vapor rises, and we get on to the next bit. But another place rain can land is on the land or in water. So for example, rivers, oceans, and just on the land in stuff like puddles. So there's no plants involved in this. And basically after this, what happens is evaporation. So the water evaporates into water vapor, and this rises. So both of these things, the water vapor rises. And it goes up, and the moist air cools it down after rising, bringing it all together and condensing it, which creates clouds. And then as these clouds get big enough, they start to shoot out rain, snow, or hail and fall down as precipitation again, and then it continues the cycle. So let's move on to the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle starts when CO2 enters the atmosphere due to respiration and combustion. So this is respiration, breathing out, because that's carbon. Also combustion, burning of things, causes CO2 to rise. So next, carbon dioxide is absorbed by plants through photosynthesis. So as we know, plants breathe in carbon dioxide and they breathe out oxygen, which is the opposite of humans and animals. So next, animals eat plants, they gain carbon from them, and then the animals die. So this, and they release CO2 through respiration whilst they were alive, these animals do, because as we know, they breathe in oxygen, breathe out CO2. We've already just said that. So then these animals decompose and send carbon back to the atmosphere, because animals decomposes, turn them down into carbon, and the carbon just goes up. So next, what happens if some don't decompose? Well, they get turned into fossil fuels. Fossils get burned. Also, when plants die, they also get turned into fossil fuels and get burned as well. So this creates more CO2 as well. So whatever happens, it'll always turn into CO2 one way or another, which is intriguing. So it will always restart the cycle. That's what I find interesting with a lot of these cycles. There are a lot of different paths, and you've got to remember both ways. It's not just a simple circle. There's many ways around it. So next, let's look at the recycling of materials. So let's look at decay. So decay, basically, there's certain conditions that are needed for decay to take place. So they need to have enough oxygen, they need to be warm, and they need to be moist. So how are animals decayed? They're decayed by decomposers and detritivores. So decomposers are things like bacteria and fungi, and detritivores are things like maggots, worms, and beetles. So basically these eat your animals and break them down until there's nothing left of them. And the carbon from them is going into the atmosphere because they don't want the carbon. So next, let's look at where are we going? Biodiversity. That's a pretty important one. This is probably the biggest bit on here. There's a variety of the different species of organisms. So this could be on Earth or inside a smaller ecosystem, which is all the animals that are and plants that are in an area. So if biodiversity is high, we get hotspots, which means there's a variety of plants. And if there's a variety of plants, this means that there must be a lot of animals there because it's the start of the food chain. Also, if it's high, that helps us ensure ecosystem stability. And this is because there's a range of predators and prey. So as long as we have enough prey, there's enough for the predators to eat. And as long as we have enough predators, the prey won't get out of control and there won't be too many of them. it all works together in a system. So next, let's look at human impact on this and make ourselves feel terrible about ourselves. So first, let's look at deforestation. So basically, that's cutting down trees and stuff, and it can destroy habitats, which is a bad thing. And also, it stops the trees from absorbing CO2. And because of this, CO2 is released when they're destroyed. Also, if they're burned as fuel, CO2 is also released. So there's two ways from that less CO2 is being stored, meaning it causes global warming. Another thing that causes global warming is methane, which comes from cows and rice, which is interesting. Global warming, one important thing about global warming is the increasing change of the greenhouse effect. So the greenhouse effect is basically a layer that stores all the heat in our planet, and basically it's getting stronger, meaning there's even more stuff in there because it's like a layer of gases. So it causes less biodiversity because a lot of animals aren't adapted to the increased heat. So certain animals are covered in fur that are in places that used to be cold and now they're warmer might not be able to survive, which could have a bad impact on a lot of other animals in that ecosystem, even if it doesn't affect them directly. Another thing is the rising sea level, because ice melts as the temperatures rise around the Earth. So that's why you get all those pictures from the Arctic and all the ice is melting and there's all the polar bears and they're all pretty sad. This can also lead to things like flooding in certain areas, because if the ice is melting and it's drifting into the sea, certain islands might get covered in it because they're lower down. So another thing that changes is migration patterns, because certain animals, like birds, migrate at different times of the year because it's too cold. But if it's actually warm instead, they won't need to, so they won't go to the new habitat and affect that, which could have a negative impact on other animals or plants, mostly animals. So next, let's look at acid rain. So acid rain is all about sulfuric acid. So that's what's released. That's the bad thing we're creating by burning fuel. So basically what it does is it kills a lot of plants because it's acidic and the plants aren't used to acid. So it destroys the start of the food chains, which is pretty bad because it can end up killing many animals in an area, because something would eat the plants and something would eat the things that eat the plants. But we'll get onto that later. Now let's look at eutrophication. So it's basically the pollution of water systems through fertilizers. So because of this, a lot of plants die through competition. So there's just a load of big plants and all the little plants are dead at the bottom of the water, and that brings a load of bacteria in, which steals all the oxygen from the fish. So the fish end up dying and most of the plants end up dying, which is pretty bad. So let's move on to our final bit of this. This was a long video. I was not expecting to be so long, which is on pyramids. So let's look at pyramids. So this is a pyramid, a really badly drawn pyramid. So basically what it does is it shows the lowest part of the food chain up to the highest and how many there are there. So this is the producer. So this is the one that makes its own energy through photosynthesis. So this is your plants. It's on the first trophic level. And the next thing is the primary consumer. So this eats the plant or the producer. It's the second trophic level. The secondary consumer would be the thing that ate the primary consumer and would be on the third trophic level. So you're basically layering up a food chain. Also, there's different types of these pyramids. So there's, of course, a number pyramid, which would show you the amount. So there's about 50 there. There's just under 25 there, and there's about 10 there, I'd say. However, the pyramid of biomass takes mass into account, so there's a calculation using mass to figure out what it is instead, which I don't think we need to know. Also, though, these pyramids can look upside down because you could have a very small amount of plants and a very big amount of things eating the plants. For example, things like flies. You'd have if there were flies that ate plants, you'd have thousands of flies and you'd only have a few plants because flies are so small. And then biomass makes up for that, and we'll see that another time. So that's pretty good. Ecology. Thank you for watching and goodbye. Also join my Discord. It's pretty good.